So let me just share my screen with everybody. Hi everyone. If you didn't come to my session this morning, hello and welcome. Just let me know where you're from and where you're watching from. Some of you are saying hello again. So hi Natasha, hi Inga. Yeah, perfect. Lots of attendees that have stayed for this session and attended Michael's session beforehand as well. So let me just share my screen with you. Bear with me a second. So if you did attend this session earlier, you'll know exactly what we're talking about with inclusive practices, but we will go over this again just as an overview. So in this session, we're talking about using inclusive practices to deliver and develop personalised lessons. So I gather everyone can hear me and see my screen okay, as everyone's saying hello. Nice to see some familiar names as well. So before we get started, as I said earlier, my name's Billy. I was a teacher and for about 9 years, and now I am a writer and also a teacher trainer and a speaking examiner. And I also have a professional development podcast for teachers called ELT CPD, so do check that out. So in this session, we will be discussing, we'll do a quick review of inclusive practices for those of you who didn't attend the earlier session. We'll be talking about what personalisation is exactly and why it's important, and also how to use inclusive practices to personalise your lessons, and techniques for adapting activities to be inclusive and personalised. So hopefully you'll take away lots of activity ideas and tips from this session. So as we said, the session is about inclusive practices and personalisation. But if you didn't come to the earlier session, this will be new for you. If you did, it's just a quick overview to remind you of those inclusive practices, and there may be some new points in there for you as well. So for those of you who did come to the session earlier, what is meant by the term inclusive practices? Can you give me any examples of inclusive practices? Please do write some answers in the chat box. I'll just give you a moment. Little quiz for those of you who attended earlier, or perhaps if you didn't, perhaps you sort of are familiar with inclusive practices and what exactly the term encompasses. Okay, so we've got our first answer. Christina says, getting everyone involved. Exactly, it's about getting everyone involved, making it accessible, individualized, differentiated according to our learners' needs and abilities. Yep, Petra said multiple means of representation. Exactly, representation of different diversities and backgrounds and experiences. Personalization. Ursula said exactly, valuing differences, encouraging positive attitudes. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that it's including everybody and not just those with different abilities to others. So not just those with disabilities, it's about absolutely everybody, because everybody here in the chat box and in this session is unique. So it's just incorporating that. Valda's written a really nice summary here, a teaching approach that recognises the differences between students and uses this to ensure all students can access educational content and participate fully in their learning. Lovely summary. So let's just have a quick review of this and break each of the 6 terms down a little further. As I said, there will be some new points in here if you did attend earlier. So firstly, recognising and valuing diversity. So this means recognising every individual and every learner is different, has differences in their needs, abilities, ways of learning. And not only those things that we physically know about, like a disability, perhaps hard of hearing, impaired vision, for example, but also things that we recognise as teachers. So differences in our learners, as I said, just as all of us in this session are unique in our own ways as well. So when we're talking about diversity in learners, we could be referring to physical abilities, social backgrounds, behavioural differences as well, learner styles, age, gender, race, ethnicity, identity, religion, beliefs. So we're just respecting each other, recognising that individuality is a strength. The second point is encouraging positive attitudes towards diversity. So making sure every learner is listened to and able to express themselves freely, fairly, and equally. And a way to do this is to model that behaviour for learners so they know exactly how to have a positive attitude and recognise diversity and individuality as well. We also need to think about the resources and tools we're using with our learners and that they're accessible to everyone. So again, these are not just things that we know or students have made us aware of, but things that we pick up on as well. So for example, could be using subtitles when necessary for videos, thinking about the colours that we're using in our presentations. For example, I've got a lot of yellow on this screen here. If you put blue onto yellow, it's not very clear. And there's a great dyslexia handout if you just Google Pearson Dyslexia as well. There's a great sort of accessibility PDF as well that you can download for free. And it's also the activities we're doing. So all students are able to participate without any boundaries to access. Thirdly, we need to ensure we're using pedagogical strategies to ensure and encourage inclusive education. So just making sure everyone is able to contribute to the lesson, to be heard, and that we're personalising those lessons according to our learners' needs and abilities. If you do have any questions as we go along, please do feel free to write anything in the chat box because I know this is an overview if you didn't attend the session earlier. The next 3 points. So point 4 here, we've got involving parents, learners, and other relevant individuals in creating an inclusive learning environment. So we're remembering that every single person involved in school life has an impact on our learners. That's not just us as teachers. We might automatically think about the teachers and the students, but it's anyone involved. So everyone at the school, caregivers, parents, guardians, even the people they come across on the way to school. So we need to consider inclusivity for everyone involved. So if there's a language barrier for parents, we can build a bridge between this so they feel involved in their child's learning. Or if maybe they don't, sort of your learners don't know anybody at the school that works there except for you as a teacher, perhaps having an introductory session of all of the admin staff or your director of studies or whoever you have at your state school, perhaps just getting them to feel more involved, and the students will feel safer and more confident as well. Next, we move on to using variety in assessment to demonstrate learner progress. And assessment can often be tricky because, as we said, they're sort of quite standardized and therefore they're not designed to be particularly inclusive. They're sort of a one size fits all. However, it's our job as the teacher to ensure that all of our learners can participate in the exam, as a lot of you have said in the chat box. So it's ensuring that our learners can participate and also participate in the preparation for the exam. So making sure that those who may need extra support or guidance can access this and complete the assessment equally and fairly as everybody else in the room. So when we're referring to assessment, we should also think about the ways that we're giving feedback. So we're building learner confidence, showing how much progress they're making on their course. And with each assessment they take as well, there's progress. So we should try to make learners a part of their goal setting journey as much as possible. So we can personalize assessments, and we'll look at ways to do that shortly. And also help focus the learning on the individual rather than as a collective class. So our final point is supporting learners in identifying, addressing, and assessing learner goals. So we may need to make adjustments to our ways of teaching and consider this just to make our lessons more inclusive, as this can help us make sure that we're not excluding anyone from the teaching or the learning process. And we need to help learners identify what's important to them, their motivation for learning. Often it might be to pass an exam because their parents want them to, perhaps they need a visa or university, for example, but also there has to be a reason why they're personally learning, even if it's just to improve their language skills, to get by, as we said, to study in another country. So it's important to find out what's important to them in their learning journey, what their goals are and what they're hoping to achieve. And then this will help build their confidence in their own abilities and understand how they're going to reach those goals that they've set themselves after some discussion with us as the teacher. And we can relate to this assessment in a way, particularly if we use formative assessment to help us plan our lessons going forward and to help students understand for themselves what they need to work on and improve. So let's move on to personalisation, so the main focus of our session. So a question for you: what is personalisation? What is meant by this term in the English language classroom? So I'll just give you a minute to write your answers. Okay, so we've got adjusting to an individual approach. Perfect. Individual attitudes. Yeah. Students' needs, making tasks relevant to your context. Yeah, perfect. But also the learner context. Allowing students to make the exercise theirs. Nice. Natalia says individual tasks. Yeah, I think that's really important, individual tasks, but it's also quite scary as a teacher to think, how am I supposed to plan all of these individual tasks for my learners, particularly if you're teaching a large class? Yeah, we've got learning materials, talking about themselves. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is all about yourself and as a learner. And as we know, people like talking about themselves. So it is motivating and engaging for the learners, and also to learn about other people as well. So personalization is an approach that tailors around the specific needs and abilities of each of your students. Now, as I said, this can sound like quite a daunting thing, particularly if you do have large classes. I remember I was teaching in China and I had sort of 55 to 70 students in some of my classes. So you're sort of left wondering, like, how can I personalize my class to that many students? So you might have 10, 15, which is still a lot of students to personalize lessons for. The likelihood is, though, when it comes to your learners' interests, many of your students may have commonalities, which can be really helpful when planning a lesson around a particular topic, let's say sports or music, for example. So you also need to consider your learners' needs and abilities. So really thinking about our inclusive practices here and ensuring the classroom activities, the topics and resources are accessible and suitable for all of our learners' needs. Personalization is also focusing on the learners and the activities that they might enjoy, rather than the given topics in a course book, for example. So this is not always possible, as depending on your school, you might have a curriculum that you need to follow and things that you need to get through, perhaps to prepare your students for an exam. But you can personalize these given topics in a course book according to what you know about your students over time. And a positive thing about personalization is that it allows for authentic communication. Learners are able to express themselves. As I said, they're generally more engaged and motivated when talking about your own experiences so that they can participate in the lesson. They'll have thoughts and ideas on the topic and the activities that they've specified that they're interested in and able to do as well. So we've talked about what it is, but I want you to think about if there's any disadvantages to personalization. Interesting question. If you do have any ideas, please do feel free to write them in the chat box. I'll just give you a minute. Any disadvantages? I think I sort of mentioned the preparation time, perhaps. It's quite daunting for a teacher to think, how am I supposed to personalize for all of my 25 students, for example? Yeah, Tatiana agrees, and a lot of people are agreeing actually coming through. It takes too much time, it's time consuming. Interesting comment from Klaus, too personalized can become boring for some. I mean, it depends on the length of your lesson. Of course, you can't keep personalizing to every student in every lesson, but obviously if we can do it in general and perhaps not in every single lesson, but at least one or two activities in every lesson, it might become second nature to us and then reduce our preparation time. Christina, exactly, I agree with you. If your class is big, it can be quite challenging. I'm not sure how many students you have in your class, but especially with sort of older adults and things if you don't get to spend much time with them either. Yeah, becoming bored takes a lot of time. Yeah, an interesting comment here, doesn't prepare the students for teamwork in a company. So perhaps that's a business English situation where it needs to be more sort of uniform and working as a group. Exactly. So the theme that's coming through mostly is time consuming. So let's see how we can tackle that. But first, some things that I thought about is, firstly, you need to take the time to get to know your learners when you first start teaching them. So in the early stages of your course, it might be difficult to implement personalization into your classes compared to the latter stages of your course. Also, if you don't have them for a very long time, it can be difficult. I remember in my last language school, I had 6-month courses, but some of the students were coming for 2-week periods. So getting to know them was quite challenging. Also, as we're talking about inclusive practices, we need to consider the cultural background of our learners, particularly if we teach a multilingual class, so many languages in the same classroom. Perhaps it's not common to express yourself, your thoughts, your opinions and ideas in a certain culture. So our students may come across as shy or seem as though they aren't participating as much as others, when in fact they're behaving appropriately for what they're used to in their own culture. So this comes back to recognizing diversity in our learners and ensuring our students are displaying positive attitudes and behaviors towards each other. A good way to tackle that would be to simply talk about these things. In one of your early lessons, what are the cultural norms and traditions in your country? How do you address people? How do you speak to your teachers? How do you speak to each other? Is it quite expressive or not? Particularly Asian cultures, perhaps. And finally, there's always something we're not going to know about our learners. We can't know everything about everyone. So we may unintentionally trigger a negative emotion or a past trauma that we're unaware of, particularly around certain topics, let's say family, for example. So it's just important to be mindful of these things when we're preparing our lessons. Especially, I think there was a topic about traveling recently, and a few of my students had never sort of traveled, they just stayed in their own town. So it's just being aware of these things when we're preparing our lesson, and just to consider why someone might not be participating as you might expect them to in a class. So I'm going to have a look at some tips for personalizing your lesson. So as we mentioned, it can be difficult early on in your course to personalize classes if you don't know your learner. So do try to find out as much as you can about your learners from day one. So a good way to do this is you could get your students to do a presentation about themselves, maybe about things they love or their hometown or something that they're deeply passionate about. Could be anything at all. This would just be to get to know them. And if they don't feel comfortable presenting in front of the class, they can do it in small groups, and you can observe, listen, and take notes as well as you're going around. Something which I think us as teachers are often afraid to do is to give up control. We think we're the teacher, the students must learn from us at all times. But in fact, it can be really helpful to ask your learners exactly what they like and what they don't like in the lesson. So this works really well after, say, a week or 2 weeks, and they've had a chance to go through the course book, try different activities. Often I remember a lot of students would groan when I introduced writing, and they're like, oh, another writing task. So it's interesting to find out what they like and what they don't. And that really affects engagement in the lesson and the way that they perform in those types of tasks. So as I say, these can be related to activities, to task types, to ways of working, and so on. And there's no limit to the number of times you can do this. You could ask them every week, and it'll definitely save you time planning, as well as making the students the focus of the lesson and likely more engaged, as they know they would have had some input into their lessons or course. And I think that really helps with what the majority of you were saying in the chat box about it being time consuming. Just ask your students, what would you like to do next week? Maybe not in the lesson today, unless you like teaching spontaneously, but it will really help you plan your lessons going forward as well. Allow time and space for students to share their own experiences. I think it's very easy during the feedback of a task, say discussion questions, for example, to get students to share their answers and then move on to the next student to share, let's say, what they discussed or their answers, for example. But don't be afraid to divert away from your lesson plan or your intention for the lesson, especially if you write aims on the board at the beginning. Don't be afraid to divert away from them in some cases, because sometimes that's when the best language comes out, and also when students feel most engaged and involved as they've directed the class. So they can share their experiences, their opinions, and it may even push sort of quieter students to join in and do the same. This has happened many, many times for me in my previous language school. I went in with the intention of perhaps teaching a grammar point. We introduced that grammar point, and then it led into a whole discussion about the grammar point in their language, when it's used, and then it turned into a discussion topic, but it was all in English. So it was excellent, and we did meet the aims of the lesson. And finally, it's super important to personalize language and grammar from the lesson. So quite often lead-in activities and speaking activities in course books are already quite personalized, but grammar, reading, listening, and vocabulary activities often aren't. But don't be afraid to mix it up, supplement, or turn one of the gap-filled sentences into a discussion topic, for example. And we'll look at more examples of how to personalize your course book in just a moment. So we've looked at personalization and what it is, but why is it important? So the learning process is generally non-linear. So teachers can't expect all the students in the class to learn in the exact same way or even at the exact same pace. So it helps students learn skills that go beyond the classroom, which will help them in their future lives, which is particularly useful if you're teaching young learners, children or teenagers as well. They'll learn and practice goal setting, self-assessment and reflection, and they'll be able to recognize their likes and dislikes and what motivates them, because learning is a lifelong process. Wherever we are, even in the world of work, we're still learning every day. Personalization helps ensure all students are treated equally and fairly, and studies have shown that it spurs motivation and engagement in lessons, as it's more student-centered and learners recognise that they're a part of their own learning process. It's not just up to the teacher. It allows students to self-reflect, particularly if they've set their own goals and have been given praise and feedback to help them improve their language skills and reach their objectives. Please do feel free to add any other ideas as to why personalisation is important in the chat box if you'd like to as well. So, how can we personalise our lessons using inclusive practices? How are these things related? So, first of all, we have two activities here, which are quite good examples of how to get to know your students and just ways to allow them to express themselves. So on the left here in the yellow, we've got a show and tell activity. So during your course, you could have students show a photo, a video, or prepare a presentation about something important to them. Again, this is sort of related to getting to know your students at the beginning of the course, but again, you could do it at any time throughout as well. So you could have them present it to you first, so you can give personalized feedback to them before they present it to the class. They've got that opportunity to improve, again, building that learner confidence. Alternatively, you could have them present in groups or pairs as well. Next, we have a changing photos activity where students replace the photos from the course book with images from their own lives and experiences. So this example is taken from Pearson's Roadmap course on a unit about cultures and traditions, which really lends itself nicely to personalization and recognizing diversity and positive attitudes towards it as well. So for example, it was, I think this was all just about recognizing different cultures. So there were pictures from different situations around the world. So you could say, show me a picture from where you live, for example. I'm pretty sure that all of your students would have taken some sort of image, or even if they want to Google it and show you, just so we're really building that diversity and positive awareness around individuality as well. So let's move on to how we can personalize our course materials. So in these examples, I'm using Pearson's roadmap course, and I've written the specific levels, units and pages at the bottom here if you are using this particular course book for reference as well. So on the left here, in the first activity, we have a lead-in, which I said often lends itself quite nicely to personalisation. Often they're discussion questions about their own experiences. But this one from Unit 3 was about food. The topic was about food. So it was, tell me what foods you see in the pictures. But I've changed the questions. So you can ask learners if they know or have tried the foods themselves before you elicit the foods that they see. You could say, is this food common in their country? What are some traditional foods in their country? And just get them to explain it a little bit more. As this is B2, they should have some vocabulary to be able to explain perhaps the texture of the food, the spiciness, the saltiness, the crunchiness, things like that, hot, cold. So just really getting them to talk about their own experiences with food before doing the activity in the course book. And then we have a matching activity here. So it's very easy for us to say match 1 to 9 with A to I, for example. But before you do that, or after you do that, you could use the language to get learners to discuss if they like this sort of food. Not all of the words will lend themselves to it, but things like spicy, salty, creamy food, crunchy food. You could even say, what have you eaten that was greasy? Does anyone know how to cook meat so it's not tough, for example, or something along those lines. And then you could get them to describe a food that they've eaten or is common in their country using the adjectives as well. And you can link these two activities together so they can describe the pictures using this language as well. And if you have any questions, by the way, please do feel free to write them in the chat box. Next, we have a grammar activity, which we mentioned earlier is one of the more difficult parts of a course or a lesson to personalize. But something you can do is to have students create their own questions to ask their classmates. So you could do this with any grammar topic. I've just picked Unit 1 question forms here, but you could do it with conditionals, with tag questions, question formation as I've chosen, present perfect. The list is endless. So you can use the content from the activity and turn the sentences into questions, or have students write their own. Depending on the confidence and the ability of your class, you could get them to turn them into questions, or you could do it for them. So they could then use this for a pair or group discussion activity, or perhaps a mingling task where they walk around the class. Or if you do have that opportunity to work with other classes in your school, mingling with another class and asking the questions as well, which is quite a nice opportunity to meet other people. And then we have a writing activity here from B2 Unit 4, again, which is quite tricky to personalize often. So this is about writing an email about a job. But in the previous session, we talked about lived experiences, and perhaps if we're teaching younger teens or teenagers, they've never sort of had a job before. Perhaps they've never even looked at a job advert. So it's very difficult for them to sort of relate to the task. So instead of using the job advert in a book, for example, you could have them think of a fantasy job, a job that maybe they'll never do, but something that they would absolutely love to do. So for me, this would be to be on stage in the theatre, singing, dancing, that sort of thing. When I was younger, not anymore. So a fantasy job or a job they'd like to have in the future, and have them research that job online. And then in a group, they can brainstorm the personal qualities that someone might need for that job. So if you're in the theatre, for example, you would need confidence. You would perhaps need to have quite thick skin because you might get some boos and people might not like your performance and things like that. So really working collaboratively, just so we're really personalising the course book. And don't be afraid to do it either. If you think, oh, I'm not really sure that my students will know what a job advert is, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you feel it's not working, just decide to sort of change the activity and say, okay, if it's not working for your group, think of a fantasy job and do it that way. An interesting question in the chat box: how much time does it take to go through the unit like this? As you'll see at the bottom, I've chosen different units. So I've just taken one activity from each unit, because I know a lot of us were talking about how time consuming it can be. So if you just take one or two activities, and hopefully these activities here apply to your grammar or your writing in your unit that you've chosen. So just doing one or two activities would hopefully not take too much time to personalize, because you're not doing the whole lesson. Moving on to activity 5 and 6, we have a listening activity here. Again, quite tricky to personalize a listening comprehension task. But as an example, you could turn the questions into personalized discussion questions. So for example, we've got a question in 2A, how long has he been saving up his money? So you could say, have you ever saved up money? What is the problem with taking the bus? You could say, when was the last time you took the bus? And then we've got, why is he worried in terms of having a bike? Do you have a bike? And finally, the last question, we could say, do you think a bike is better than a car? If your comprehension activities lend yourself to this, it's a great opportunity to personalize. You could also use the audio script to pick out specific language, which you could then turn into a small research project. So students find out the definitions and then write their own questions with that language as well. So using the audio script is a really, really good way to do it. A similar sort of thing on the right-hand side. So in Roadmap, there's a lot of functional language sections where in this particular one, the topic is irony. So it's when you say, well, when what you mean is different from what you actually say. So, oh, it's a lovely day today when it's freezing cold, for example. So you could turn this into a discussion, because reading through a functional box can often be, well, you don't know if your students have actually read it unless you ask questions. So you could say, do you often use irony? In what situations might you use irony? And is irony commonly used in your culture? Which is actually a really good question, because humor, irony, different ways of communicating are really, really different all around the world. So that's a really nice way to personalize it. As I say, if you do have any questions, do feel free to write in the chat box about these activities as well. So we're going to look at Pearson's new hybrid learning platform, Pearson English Connect. And if you attended Michael Brand's session before this one, you'll have a good idea about the platform as he ran through it and gave you an example, and lots of activities. I liked the donkey and the whiteboard. If you did miss it, the session was recorded, but I will just give you a really quick overview as I saw some people join sort of later. So Pearson English Connect is a new platform which is designed to help you teach effectively in the hybrid world. As we know, things have changed significantly over the last couple of years. The content, which are your course books, your Pearson course books, they're interactive and auto-graded, so students can learn at their own pace, which is perfect for your inclusive classroom, as we know every learner is different. So you can teach through the platform, as it has its own video conferencing software that you can teach through. And you can assign activities and tasks which you can monitor as the teacher to help you with your class pace and staging as well. And it's really, really useful, because if you think your students have sort of got too much at that point, you can pause and assign tasks later on, or vice versa. You can overload them if you know they're working quickly. A great feature, which is super unique to the platform as well, is that you can ask your learners questions and they can respond. And the content on the platform has a sort of gamification feature. If you're not familiar with this term, it means that activities are sort of lightly competitive and sort of in a game-styled way, which has been proven by research to motivate and engage learners in what they're learning as well. And once learners have completed an activity or set of activities, they can see their progress through lesson reports and a detailed gradebook, as Michael showed you in the previous presentation. So this can really help students set their own goals and understand where they are and where they're heading towards on their learning journey. And this is really important in inclusive classroom practices. So essentially, as a summary, Pearson English Connect has everything you need for teaching and learning all in one place. So no need to switch from one platform to another. Everything is where you need it to be. Finally, because it's been very difficult through the pandemic, flicking from one thing to the next, trying to keep our online learners motivated, going from an interactive whiteboard to our presentation. You've got your interactive whiteboard, you've got your presentation tool, you've got everything you need and all of your course books and video conferencing needs as well. So we've been looking at so we've looked at Pearson English Connect, but now we're going to look at how to use it with Roadmap in particular. So the course that we've been using so far in this presentation. So Roadmap is great because you can really personalize your lessons according to your learners' skills and abilities. And Michael in the previous session actually showed you how to access the platform and Roadmap itself. So do check out the recording of the session if you missed it. So with Pearson English Connect, you can log in and you can open your Roadmap course. And if you do already use Roadmap, you'll know that the name sort of relates to the different roads and avenues you can take to achieving your learning goals as a student. So for example, you can have it for an extended course with all of the skills focus lessons, video lessons, or you can simply use the main course book content for sort of a shorter course. And each lesson is designed with different learner styles in mind. So there's lots and lots of videos which are visual and audio aids, as well as your more traditional heads down approach as well, and lots of freer discussions which are really personable. At the end of each lesson, you'll see here I've got develop your reading on the second box. So these are signposts, so you can tailor your class to your learners. For example, if you get through your unit about food and you know your students need extra reading practice or writing practice, you'll see the signpost in the bottom right-hand corner, and you can go to the develop your reading or develop your writing, speaking, listening skills, and so on. And these can really help create an inclusive learning environment, particularly if you know your learners struggle with a particular skill or an area, you can really focus and hone in on that skill. If you feel like your learners, not all of your learners need that extra reading practice, you can assign it to some of your learners for homework, and you can set those activities through the platform and they can get their automated grades and do multiple attempts if they want to as well. So you can monitor the students' progress and your performance. And as Michael mentioned, you can see the exact same as your students do, which is really important because often we're thinking, what does it look like from the learner's point of view? It looks different for me as a teacher. So you'll see the detailed progress reports and the grade book from your learners after they've done the activities. You can see at the bottom here, I did one attempt and luckily I had no errors, but I only did 16% of the activity. So you can allow your students to see their tangible progress throughout the course. They can see the percentage of the questions that they got right that you assign them as well. And then have feedback with them, discuss with them, what would you like to achieve? What can I do to help you on this journey? Would you like more practice activities? And perhaps if it is a writing activity, for example, you can go to one of those signposts, develop your writing, and plan your next lesson accordingly, depending on how your students do in the activities that you set. Lots of thanks coming through in the chat box. So thank you very much for giving your ideas so far in this presentation. Someone asked a question, let me just find it, about irony. Is there any language in the world that doesn't use irony? That's a very good question. And if anyone knows, do feel free to write in the chat box. I know in the UK we use it all the time. So yeah, let's go on to our next really important point is assessment. So as we said, assessment is really standardized sometimes. It's not particularly inclusive. However, you can assign tests through Pearson English Connect. We're going with assessments, not tests. You can assign assessments through Pearson English Connect. And you can see some examples here. So if you're using Roadmap, you'll have a variety of tests in your test package available to you. At the moment, you might see it on your Pearson English portal. So you've got unit tests, achievement tests, placement tests, end of unit tests, and so on. So earlier, someone asked about formative and summative assessments. So your end of unit test would be a good example of a summative assessment. An achievement test, again, would be a good summative assessment, or you could use it at particular points throughout the unit as well. So yeah, you can see some examples in the top right-hand corner. I signed into my Pearson English Connect, And I went to the 5th tab along, the test generator, and I looked at the achievement tests, and it tells you the number of questions. So in the bottom right hand corner here, you can see I opened it, but something that's really useful is you can use the test generator. So it's sort of, and you can see it in the blue font here in the first image, it sort of randomizes the questions, which is really useful, because if you've got 2 students, 3 students sitting next to each other in the class, they can't copy each other because the questions are randomized in a random order. Same questions, just a different order. So these marks go straight to the grade book, which as a teacher you can see, but also your learners, and you have the same view, as I said, so you can really see what your students can see, and this can help you plan your lessons and what to revise going forward. So we're coming to the end of the session, and I have a question for you. So what are you going to take away from this session, or perhaps the previous session about inclusive practices, to personalize your lessons going forward? So I'll just give you a moment to write in the chat box. So something you're going to take away. For me, I think personally, it's considering everyone in the learner journey, not just me and the students. I think it's considering absolutely everybody that the students come into contact with. Me making more of an effort with the parents and the guardians and the caregivers who perhaps don't speak English and won't be able to see the sort of progress that they would if they could speak the language. So let's have a look at some ideas. Natalia said, trying the Pearson platform, excellent. Iwona said, more conversation, less writing. Yeah, and don't be afraid to turn writing tasks into speaking tasks as well. We don't always need to give them the full length writing tasks. Sometimes it's nice to just mix things up. Myrna said, asking for feedback about what students like and don't like. Yeah, remember you can do that at any time during your course. Nina said the changing photos activity, which is really nice. Yeah, just get students to show you an example from their own experiences. Helena said trying to personalize on a regular basis. Yeah, as I said, you don't need to do the whole lesson and the whole unit. Taking 1 or 2 activities is really useful. And all of the activities I mentioned here, you can adapt to your own grammar, writing or listening activities as well. Sergey said, making sure everyone can see what's written on the board. Yeah, that's something I really need to focus on, my handwriting on the board, actually. It's easier said than done sometimes. Let's go to the bottom. We also had, the exchanging photos is really nice. Reformulating personalized questions, giving students the opportunity to choose what they like. I think they'll really, really appreciate that, actually. They'll be a bit surprised by it at first. Is this a trick? Am I allowed to tell you what I don't like? But yeah, once they get used to it, and you know that they know that you're going to ask them, they'll have prepared their answers and tell you exactly what they like. So I do have just a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any questions, do feel free to write in the chat box. But if not, thank you all so much for coming today and participating. It's been great sort of getting to know you all, and hearing about your experiences and sharing your ideas.